Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar series Logistics Launchpad, where we focus on the needs of small but fast-growing businesses. I'm Ted Bagelin, and I am the General Manager of Flexport's Small and Medium Business Group, and it is my absolute pleasure to be hosting you today on the webinar. We are going to cover two very important topics, the first being inventory planning and the second being your cash cycle. And our hope is at the end of this that you truly feel empowered and ready to master both of those disciplines. Before we dive in, it is important that we go through a quick disclaimer, so take a second to read the words on the slide. Okay, I also have the real joy of having three fantastic co-hosts that are going to be on this webinar with me today. The first being Andre Neumann-Lorek. So Andre is the co-founder and managing partner of OnTap Consulting, which he co-founded in 2013. Andre has a team of 25 experts in operations and sales, and they have supported hundreds of startups on their journey to success. Prior to OnTap, Andre was a VP of engineering, manufacturing, and operations at Cisco Systems. And prior to that, he built and led successful teams at Pure Digital Technologies, where he was the COO. Welcome, Andre.
Good morning. Thanks very much, Ted. I'm delighted to be here.
Next, we're going to have Justin Sherlock. So Justin is the head of Flexport's capital business, which is Flexport's lending group. Justin and his team help Flexport clients with financing solutions that assist them in accelerating their actual global trade volumes and growth. And they all focus on helping our customers reduce the working capital demands of global trade. And they very much specialize in shaping financing to the client's needs. So prior to joining Flexport, Justin spent 2 years in investment banking at Barclays, and then a few years in private equity investing at TA Associates. Justin, say hello to the group.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for having me, Ted. Really excited to talk about inventory and cash cycles today.
And finally, we're going to have Jeet Shah. So Jeet is the Director of Business Operations at Flexport. Prior to joining us, he spent 8 years at Apple with roles in global supply management and manufacturing operations. And then he also had 2 years leading operations at a hardware startup. On top of that, Jeet holds a master's in supply chain management from MIT. Hello, Jeet.
Hello, good morning. My pleasure to be here this morning.
Okay, so this is the crew of all-star experts in logistics that are going to help us tackle these topics. And we are going to have a very packed agenda. We're going to start with where you might be today. So going from product market fit to scale. We're going to talk through some of the conditions that create challenges with inventory planning and working capital. And then we'll close off with some practical tools that you can use today to improve your business. And we'll spend some time on Q&A. So if you have a question that pops up, make sure that you submit that through the On24 platform, and we will do our best to answer all questions. So with that, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about exactly why we're here. At Flexport, a lot of our customers ask the same question to us. They say, I have product market fit. I have customers who want my product, and I feel like I've really succeeded in creating something that consumers or other end customers want. And then the question that's top of mind is, how do I scale? How do I go from customers wanting my product to being a thriving, growing business? And in particular, clients often ask us, why does that feel so hard? And if you have that exact same question, you're definitely in the right place and you're not alone. Two of the really common reasons that we hear when customers have a good product but they're struggling to scale, one is inventory and the other is cash. And they end up being very high impact reasons why fast-growing companies often struggle to scale. Inventory planning and your cash cycle are at the heart of growth, customer happiness, and profitability. And if you can't plan for those carefully, if you can't plan your inventory and your cash carefully, sometimes your success in sales and marketing can crumble into a mess of delays, upset customers, and declining bank balances. It's often very ironic. Success in one area of your business can create pressure in another. Getting this right is actually really hard, which means that companies who master these disciplines have a competitive advantage. And that competitive advantage is really difficult to replicate. And that is actually the wonderful news. So getting these two disciplines right has serious upside for your business. And the beautiful thing is that you've got people on this exact webinar who have led companies through that stage time and time again. So they're going to have really practical advice for you on how you can make the same transition. In this webinar, we're going to focus on giving you information, frameworks, and tools that you can use to get started. So first, let's talk a little bit about why these conditions exist and why it's hard to plan for inventory and cash. And really, to do that, we have to get into the minds of the different parties who are part of this ecosystem in global trade. And one is your factory and your shipper. And the factory and the shipper have a particular interest, and it's actually quite common sense. They don't want to part with the goods until they've been paid. The importer has a different set of interests. You want to make sure that you're not tying up all of your hard-earned cash in your supply chain, and you can't afford to buy the wrong SKUs or the wrong quantities. Your end customers also have different desires, whether that's a retail customer or an individual. They want products that are in stock. In particular, retail customers often don't want to pay for that product until they've been able to sell it. And of course, we know that end customers want fast and inexpensive delivery. And then layered on top of all of that is that usually you don't have a rich back set of data. And that data for decision-making often presents a constraint in the system. So when you think about this, you can think of it as kind of this constructive tension. Everybody has particular interests. And so trying to find harmony between all those interests often creates two problems. That first problem is the inventory management problem. And the second one is the working capital problem. So if you want to get great at inventory planning in your cash cycle, the key is thinking about these two problems and solving them in elegant ways. So the first one that we're going to actually dive into here is the inventory management problem. And that is where Andre and Jeet have a ton of expertise. So I'm going to hand off to Andre, who's going to walk you through the inventory management problem.
Thank you, Ted. I've been looking forward to discussing the inventory management problem. To start, we'd like to do a quick poll. And the question is, what's the biggest inventory problem that your business has faced this year? We have a list for you to consider. Perhaps you've experienced more than one of these. Pick one, perhaps the biggest or the one that's top of mind. We'll give you a minute or so to do that. While you're looking at the list, I'll just mention that each of these are actual examples of problems that our clients have faced. Some of these problems are more typical at the end of the year if your business experiences a lot of seasonality around the holidays. Others can occur throughout the year. I'll give you another 10 seconds or so to make your selection. And then we'll see the results. All right, I can't wait to see what you've all said. And here we go. So the biggest issue by far is selling out of product when you could have sold more. That's by far the biggest. We've got poor forecasting, which is something we'll talk about today as well, and a smattering of respondents for the other choices also. Yeah, and we'll address the top one, selling out of product when you could have sold more. Very good. We'll get right into this. Thank you for participating in the poll. I'd like to begin with a quote. Inventory is the root of all evil. This was something that I learned from a fabulous boss that I had early in my career. He became a good friend and mentor. His name was Jim Booth. And he drilled this into us, that inventory is the root of all evil, and ops people working for him had to keep this in mind. Over the course of my career, I've learned just how right he was. One of the insidious ways that inventory ties up your cash is that your weeks of supply can grow and get out of hand. We've worked with companies that have a few weeks of supply of finished goods, companies that have perhaps a couple of months worth of finished goods inventory, and even companies that end up with a number of quarters of finished goods inventory. I was talking with a client last week who came out of the Christmas holiday season with inventory that they hope to burn off throughout the rest of this year. They have maybe a year's worth of inventory, which is just a terrible situation to be in as it ties up your cash. And this is why when you've got physical goods or hardware that you're producing and shipping, that inventory mistakes can set your business back so much. Inventory mistakes can even sink your business if you're not careful. Our next point is that inventory doesn't age well. Jeet, would you like to take this one?
Sure. Thank you, Andre. It's a very important point because inventory doesn't age well regardless of what type of product you have. This is especially relevant if you have a product that's perishable or goes through frequent product revisions, especially for a lot of technology products. So companies often have to discount their inventory if it has deteriorated even slightly, or you have to make way for new product offerings. One example that comes to mind from my early career is when I was working on batteries, and we had built a pretty large stock of batteries, finished goods, for a large enterprise customer at their request. And they ended up sitting in storage for quite a few months, longer than they had anticipated. And they went through a very deep discharge and then had to go through extensive reconditioning with technicians to be able to be repurposed for use again, right? So this was not trivial, logistically challenging, and expensive for the client to be able to use inventory that they had stockpiled.
Yeah. Thank you, G. Yeah, the batteries is a great example. And you mentioned also that this is true for companies that go through a lot of product revision. Many startups are continuing to improve their products over time and introduce slight improvements, V1, V2, and so on, in rolling changes. If you've got inventory that's down rev, that creates all kinds of problems and issues directly on your point that it doesn't age well. Inventory is often also in the wrong place. We see this come up a lot. We worked with a client that for a product launch was planning 60% of their finished goods inventory for the US and 40% for the EU. After launch, for a number of reasons, the US demand took off much stronger than expected. And so the company was, stuck. They had to find ways to meet that surging demand. They ended up reworking the EU product, shipping it from Europe to the US, which was costly and ate into their margins. The key point I want to make here is that the more inventory nodes that you have, meaning discrete inventory locations, the more ways you have for your forecast to be wrong and for you to have to spend money to fix it, the more expensive it gets. Our next point is that inventory is often the wrong SKU. Jeet?
Yeah, this is another important consideration. SKU proliferation can wreak havoc on your supply chain and your manufacturing operations. So if you have a product with 5 different colors, then for planning purposes, you effectively have 5 products. So in a simple case, if you assume that each color will have 20% of the demand, you will most likely be wrong, right? Because customer preferences and demand patterns can vary based on a variety of factors, including geography, your channel, whether you're selling retail or direct, the season, and other patterns. So in general, you want to consider the more SKUs you have, the more challenging it is to manage the right level of inventory for each one of them.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Jeet. Your comment triggers a thought for me. You mentioned that that preferences vary across geographies. We've seen this too, haven't we? That you learn from the U.S. market what colors our consumers prefer, and you assume that maybe that's going to apply in the UK or other countries, and that's often not the case.
Exactly.
Our next point is around inventory holding costs. And I'm not talking here just about warehousing costs. Yes, your inventory will take up space. That's going to cost you money. The bigger point is that the longer you hold inventory, the more often you're going to have to update it. If you've got batteries, maybe they have to be recharged. If it's down rev, maybe you have to rework it. The longer you hold inventory, the more often you're going to have to touch it. And the more often that you have to touch it, even if it's just to move the inventory from one location to another, the more likely it is that you're going to damage it or lose some of it, suffer shrinkage, or incur other costs. So in light of these challenges with inventory, the evils of inventory, what can you do? One of the things that you can do is limit the number of SKUs at launch and at scale. Your sales and marketing people typically love adding SKUs, and often for good reason, but not always. Ops people, we hate SKU proliferation. And the reason I'm emphasizing this point here today is I want to be a counterweight to what you're going to hear from your sales and marketing people about adding SKUs. SKU proliferation makes forecasting harder. It adds hidden costs. It adds operational complexity around logistics and customer service. If you have to add SKUs, our recommendation is go slowly, learn as you go for what makes sense for your business. I think you may have an example for us, Jeet.
Yeah, I would add, Andre, that especially when companies are looking to expand their footprint across regions or dive deeper into retail for expanding their distribution, you may want to temper the appeal or the temptation to create multiple SKUs for different retailers. This creates a significant amount of additional complexity in your supply chain, and it's incredibly logistically complex and expensive to reposition inventory from one retailer to the next, and can often also involve additional costs of rework, repackaging, and some of the other costs that you mentioned, Andre, anytime you have to touch your inventory.
Okay, great points. The other thing that you can do, and we're going to go into this in some detail, is supply and demand planning. We've tried to illustrate with some of these examples that inventory mistakes are costly. If you invest in supply and demand planning, you can avoid these kinds of mistakes. And we say do it often. For businesses that are in continuous production and shipping product on a monthly basis, we generally find that it makes sense to do this supply and demand planning process at least every other week, and perhaps every week, or even more frequently during peak seasons. The key point is to get a regular cadence. So you may say, all right, what exactly is supply and demand planning? You keep talking about it. What is it? It is the intersection of your demand forecast and your committed supply. Supply and demand planning, think of it as a process and a series of ongoing meetings. It's a cross-functional process that involves operations, sales, finance, and whoever has P&L responsibility. Maybe that's the GM of your division or the CEO of your company. You want those stakeholders in the meetings as part of the process. Because in supply and demand planning, you get to see on the sales side your hard sales orders, what orders have come in versus what you had forecast. On the operations side, you get to see what finished goods inventory is coming in and when can you promise those goods to your customers. You'll be able to see if you're on allocation or if you're in an overstock position. And it's going to be one or the other. Your forecasts will be wrong. You will be, for a given SKU, either on allocation or overstocked. And if you're on allocation, what do you do about it? Who gets product? Those kinds of decisions are very impactful for the business. If you're shipping to a brick and mortar retailer and you short them on committed product, they might very well throw you out. So the decisions are high stakes. Supply and demand planning gives you the whole picture for your business in one place. Jeet, could you add to that?
Sure thing, Andre. One additional consideration you may want to think about as you plan for different scenarios is to consider the cost of overage or having too much inventory versus the cost of underage or having too little. Depending on your business or your type of product, the margin structure, the other options or alternatives your customer has access to, this may help guide your thinking around inventory levels. For example, if you're a pharmaceutical company making very high value products with a very low cost of goods sold, your margin is very high, and so your inventory carrying costs are relatively low, and the risk of stocking out is way too high, right? So pharma companies tend to carry a lot of inventory for those reasons. On the flip side, if you're in the consumer space with a relatively low margin product, your tolerance for carrying too much excess inventory might be significantly different.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that point, Jeet. And I think that, it's I want to illustrate one aspect in some of the consumer electronics businesses that I've been involved in. As a business, we spent significant amounts of money in sales and marketing. And if that's the case, then it may affect the bias that you have on the supply and demand planning question, over your bias towards overage versus underage. If you're spending money on marketing and you are out of stock, you end up being out of stock on the product, not only have you lost the sale, but you've wasted that marketing spend. And so often in those kinds of situations, ops is chartered to ensure that there's a continuity of supply, and you err on the side of carrying more inventory, provided, of course, that you can finance it.
Absolutely, Andre. And these decisions are so important because over time, they start affecting things like customer satisfaction and your brand reputation as well.
Very good. One question that we get asked a lot is, do I really need a sales and marketing forecast? My sales guys don't want to do it, or we're not very good at it, or you've told us on the webinar that our forecasts are going to be wrong anyway. Do I really need to do it? The answer is yes. Yes, you need to do a sales and marketing forecast. You need to do it regularly. At a minimum, you should be doing a monthly 6-month rolling forecast. In other words, every month have a forecast that goes out 6 months. Doing a 12-month rolling forecast is even better. I want to share a piece of HP operational wisdom that I learned early on. If you have a process that you want to improve, then measure it. Shine a light on it, focus on it to make it better. So if sales and marketing forecasting is tough, do it and measure it. Measure the accuracy of your forecast. Learn why the forecast was off. Begin to learn about the specifics of your business. What are the seasonality impacts on your business? What's the impact of a marketing program or of a press release or a PR event? What's the impact of opening a new sales channel? Learn how these things impact your forecast. Get better at your forecasting over time. And what's the role of ops? Well, you should hold ops accountable as well. Is ops bringing in the finished goods product as they had promised? If not, why not? What can you do about it? And we suggest here on the last bullet that you have ops run your supply and demand planning process and your supply and demand planning meetings. That's because ops tends to be they're well suited for this because they tend to need the output of the meeting more than anyone else. They need the forecast for the supply base and the demand signal for the supply base to do their jobs well. So it's a natural fit. Now with supply and demand planning giving you a snapshot of the business issues that you're facing, you get to decide as a cross-functional team what knobs you're going to turn and what levers you're going to pull to run the business. Let me illustrate it this way. If you're short product, then you may turn to your ops team and ask them to expedite your manufacturing, to identify and bring up second sources. If you are in an oversupply situation, you may ask ops to slow things down, and you may have an opportunity to save money by moving from air shipment to sea. On the sales side, if you're in an oversupply situation, you can turn to your sales team and see, did orders come in as expected? If not, why not? What orders can be pulled in? What incentives can be offered? What sales channels can be open? The important point here is that you've got the decision makers all in a room together, all looking at the same data, all understanding the implications. That's what makes this powerful. And we want finance there specifically to highlight those implications. Are there gross margin implications for the decisions that are being contemplated? What are the cash flow implications? Finance can provide that. And when the decisions are taken, then all of your functional leaders understand the context for those decisions and know what they need to go do and implement within their functions. Gee, there will be surprises. How will you respond to supply and demand shocks?
Thank you, Andre. During the COVID-19 pandemic, almost every single company has experienced a supply shock, a demand shock, if not both. The reality is you can't prevent or avoid these externalities, but you can plan for them. So you know how to manage them when they do occur. Companies frequently experience shocks from force majeure type events or natural disasters like hurricanes, fires, floods, and this requires careful planning and development of response plans. So how do you build your supply chain for responsiveness and resilience? Well, there's a few things you can do to help you prepare. First, you could look at creating lead time profiles of your products, including your sub-tier supply chain, and especially key components. This will help determine how quickly you can be prepared to respond. Next, you may want to look very closely at identifying the single points of failure in your supply chain and help develop risk mitigation plans. These are some of the foundational elements to help your business bounce back from shocks with hopefully very limited disruption. Back over to you, Andre.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and to accomplish what Jeet has talked about, you need a strong foundational understanding of your business, and supply and demand planning can provide that to you. If you're in a Fortune 500 company, much of this can be done via your ERP system. In a small or medium-sized business, you can use an Excel-based tool for this. At OnTap Consulting, we've developed an Excel-based tool. We've been using it for over a decade. We've used it to manage businesses in excess of 200 million and even 300 million in annual sales. So it scales well. Supply and demand planning will have improvement cycles built in, and it will allow you to manage your inventory and conserve your cash because, after all, as we know, cash is king, which brings us to Justin and our discussion today of the working capital problem. Justin, over to you.
Hey, Andre, we're actually, we've been getting a lot of questions flowing in on supply and demand planning. So before we go over to Justin, actually a question that we're getting from the audience here on the topic of supply and demand planning. So if you're a really small business, this all sounds fantastic, right? Everybody would love to have a fantastic model of supply and demand and just be living in perfect harmony. How do you get started? Sort of what's the minimum amount of information, or what are the key variables that a small business should be looking at if they're trying to create their very first supply and demand forecast?
Yeah, great question, Ted. Thank you. So, to get started, the elements that you need, we often find that companies need help in crafting what that sales and marketing forecast looks like. You've got to become the expert in your business. But we can help shape the forecast so that it's got enough granularity and enough detail so that it's useful in this process. And similarly, on the ops side, it's a matter of a disciplined approach. Ops needs to outline specifically what the supply chain has committed to do, what product is getting manufactured, and when it's going to arrive. And so you work first with ops and with sales and marketing to get those elements understood, and then they can be brought together, in an Excel-based tool to determine on a SKU by SKU basis, where you've got shortages and where you have overage.
And now is probably a good time to mention, in the bottom left side of your screen, there's a More Resources tab, right? And where you can find information about how to contact OnTap. So if you're in the situation where you say, hey, I actually need some help with this, that Excel-based model that Andre and team have sounds pretty good, you can always reach out to OnTap directly and ask them for assistance in constructing one for your own business. Jeet, another question that we got was, the pandemic did teach us a lot. And I think we saw even in our poll question that the biggest issue was not having enough inventory to being able to fulfill orders. And obviously, the pandemic affected supply chains in a pretty dramatic way. I think we can call it definitely a shock to the system. Can you expand a little bit more on cost of overage or cost of underage? If I was starting a business, what are the key inputs that I would look at to decide if I should be erring on the side of more inventory holding or less inventory holding?
That's a great question, Ted. Some of the factors you may want to think about is, what are the alternatives when you're wrong, right? So if you're looking at the side of, if you have an optimistic sales forecast and you're trying to make sure you have enough inventory to meet that upside, you may take a more aggressive inventory position. In that case, If things go well, you're in a great position, right? Sales are good, revenue is higher. How do you manage the risk if that doesn't pan out, right? So if you've taken a more aggressive inventory position, that's when you have the cost of overage. And now you have to think about what are your options to either increase sales, boost your forecast, repurpose that inventory, or move it through a different channel, or you're going to increase your sales and marketing spend to move that product now, or potentially even consider a promotion or discounts to increase your demand to be able to move that product along. On the flip side, the cost of underage comes in where you have now taken a more conservative inventory position and you've understocked and your demand outstrips your supply. In this case, you are losing out on that revenue, right? So it's really more of an opportunity cost that hurts your business. And the factors that you want to think about is how would you plan for that scenario? So if you're taking a more conservative inventory position, responsiveness becomes super critical. So what are the options you have available to your business? Can you expedite inventory that exists in your supply chain, moving it along from WIP or components into finished goods? Can you qualify alternate sources if you need to increase capacity or output? Can you expedite your finished goods through your supply chain by contacting your freight forwarder and looking at expedited freight options? These are some of the ways you can think about navigating that dilemma.
Excellent. So it's almost like create scenario plans and then think a lot about opportunity cost and what levers you would pull if you did find yourself in a position of overage or underage. Excellent advice. Okay, let's move over to Justin, who's going to talk about the working capital problem. As we've said a few times, cash is king. Over to you, Justin.
Thanks so much, Ted. I'll take that to mean that I'm the king right now, at least for the next five to 10 minutes. So money stuff, how can you use your cash more wisely? How can you get cash faster? Ultimately, the point of this webinar is how can you evolve your supply chain and your financing of your supply chain into a competitive advantage for your business. So we're going to start out with a poll here. Please pick, as we had in the prior poll, please pick the option that you think resonates with you the most for your business. These are issues that we hear from our customers all the time, especially on the Flexport Capital side in my business. When we're assessing lending opportunities, we talk through all these different issues with the client to figure out how we can best support them. So I'll give you another minute or two to fill this out, 30 seconds rather. All right, so looks like gross margins and profitability and managing cash flow are definitely two of the most common responses here. It's interesting, I think, managing cash flow is very closely tied to your inventory forecasting. We're going to talk about this going forward. Interesting, increasing working capital, only 12% of folks said that was their biggest issue. So that's interesting. Let's dive in a little bit further. So on the first slide here, we have the working capital problem. I think this is an issue that all of you know well from whether you're on the operations side and the inventory buying side and planning side, or whether you're on the finance side or you're a business owner. You understand how the inventory process results in a financial gap that you need to fill in your business. And this example here on this slide is displayed for a customer selling into retail, but an e-commerce business or a D2C business has very similar issues. Companies selling into distributors or branded products also have a similar issue here. Basically, there's a lag between when you need to pay your vendors, whether they're your suppliers or your freight forwarders or your logistics service partners, and when you get to collect cash on those goods that are being moved. And in this specific example, you can see, for selling into retail, it looks like there's about a 30-day gap between when you deliver your products to the retailer and when you actually get to collect from them. What we've actually been seeing recently on the Flexport Capital side is that retailers have actually been pushing these terms out even further. So we've outlined a 120-day working capital gap here, but if you're selling into a really large retailer, sometimes we've seen clients that have 6-month plus long working capital gaps on their supply chain. E-commerce companies also face similar problem. They actually have an extra added line item that I like to include in their working capital gap, which is their marketing expenses. In order for them to generate revenue, they have to advertise, typically online, and so I generally consider this part of their working capital gap. And as you grow faster and faster, this gap worsens, this problem worsens. You keep having to stack outlays at the beginning of this cycle, and you can't collect until all those goods have been delivered and sold. And the inability to reach rising demand, especially in a peak season, can even continue to decrease your liquidity, continue to hamper your ability to provide an excellent customer experience. It reduces your ability to be agile if there's any sort of other business shocks, or if you are in a really hot season, your product is selling really well, and you can't get as much inventory as you would like because you're out of liquidity, not just because your supplier can't provide it and you didn't plan well. You also might not have enough cash. So this is a problem I think you all know well. But the good news is there's a bunch of ways to solve it, and we'll talk through some of those now. And all of these, the solutions are not just related to, hey, come talk to Flexport Capital or a lender and let's get financing in place. There's actually a whole variety of different things you can do to optimize your working capital gap. So the first one that I think about is really to remove days from your order to cash cycle. So this is not, this is really a focus on technology and process. There are a whole variety of different technology solutions that you can implement in order to streamline your ordering and your payments process, whether it's an order management software or AP automation systems. Should you consider supplier management tools such as Talia or Tradeshift to manage your supplier contracts or how you pay your suppliers? Integrations with your ERP systems and your bank account can shave days off of your AP process. And then if you're not ready to invest in heavy sort of financial software, which is expensive and requires a whole bunch of setup work, and it's a big commitment for your business, there's cheap workflow tools. Actually, Flexport, we use Retool and Workato are two pretty affordable workflow tools that you can use to set up all sorts of operational processes in the finance realm as well as in your operations teams. And really, the expense of all these sorts of things is, it might appear more affordable if you consider the opportunity cost of being efficient with your cash and redirecting it towards more important areas of your business than just buying inventory. Also, the headcount savings of in your finance or procurement functions of having a more streamlined process. So there's definitely ways for you to optimize this order to cash cycle. I encourage you to think about that first before you even think about talking to your suppliers and negotiating your terms and then talking to financing providers. So the next step is, as I just alluded to, your payment terms and your seasonality. This is probably the first thing that we ask our customers about when we start to assess a lending opportunity for them and how Flexport Capital can help reduce your working capital gap. We talk about what are your supplier terms, especially for small businesses, or if you're working with a new supplier, your payment terms are probably not going to be terribly favorable. And you really need to communicate in advance with your suppliers and your lenders ahead of a busy season in order to make sure that your suppliers have the right setup to support you and make sure your lenders have the right setup to support you. If you think about it, your suppliers have a very similar working capital gap to what you experience, which is they need to buy raw materials ahead of their ability to collect revenue from you. So there's a cost for them there's a cost of capital that they have and there's a working capital gap that they have, and so they're going to try and push terms onto you. What we've seen is that when you can bring in financing and you can reduce the supplier's working capital gap, or you can work with an importer to provide supplier financing, you can generally actually get discounts on the cost of the goods. We see in general about a 31% per 30-day discount on the price of goods if you can, basically give your supplier an extra 30 days. And then the last thing is, what are your buying patterns? So, you've come up with this demand planning forecast, this inventory planning forecast. How are you going to work with your suppliers and your lenders to make sure that you have the right availability from both of those parties when you need it the most? And that's really, really, really key. And that's what brings us to kind of the next. Oh, sorry, did I go back?
No, we have a poll here, Justin.
Okay.
Yeah. So
okay,
for the
sorry, I actually didn't realize we had a third poll here. This is terrific. So yeah. So maybe as I still have two more points to discuss on this, but if you could fill this out, it'd be really helpful to help guide sort of the rest of my dialogue here on how to address the working capital gap. I'm definitely going to dig into gaining access to capital. All right, great. So how to collect the right data to improve inventory forecasting is a big one. So I'll make sure that I end with enough time for Jeet and Andre to address that. In transit times, negotiating payment terms with customers. Okay. This is great. This is super helpful. All right. So gaining access to financing here. So it looks like we might be missing a slide or two. But all right. So maybe before I hand it back to Ted, I'll talk through how to gain access to capital and how to grow and improve after you do that. So you've mapped out your working capital gap, you've optimized it, now you need to fill it, and you need to think about the right combination of funding for your business. Most growing companies, they immediately go to equity. Their first instinct is to go to equity funding, and I think that makes sense, especially in the venture capital world and of just fast growth businesses. Everybody wants to be associated with a strong fund, or if you're not in sort of the VC mindset, you might say, all right, well, I need a healthy balance sheet in order to raise debt, and so I'm going to go raise equity first. I think both of those are totally legitimate reasons to raise equity. But I would highly encourage you not to use equity to fill the entirety of your working capital gap, because it is just excessive dilution for you as an owner that, or as a finance professional that, you can use debt providers to fill that gap. So there's a whole bunch of different tools here. You'll have bank loans, you'll have ABLs and revolvers. Will you look at a large bank or a regional bank? You'll get different offers from both and different structures and risk tolerances from both. Are you going to look at a non-bank lender? There's companies like Dwight Funding, Rosenthal, Stonegate Capital. Those are all ones that we interact with a lot at Flexport Capital. And then there's alternative lenders like Flexport Capital. We focus on retailer receivables or inventory and supply chain expenses and financing those. Or you can also find e-commerce marketing focused lenders like Clearbank. There's a growing number of alternative lenders for you to work with. I think Brex recently launched a financing business. So the list is getting longer and longer. And when you think about who to work with, because there aren't so many folks now in the space, you need to consider the expertise of your financing partners and how they fit your needs. So a traditional bank might have cumbersome lending requirements and might be slow to act, but they might also have the lowest cost of capital and might be more experienced. Non-bank lender, they might not understand the logistics and working capital needs of your business in particular, and they might not offer the best structure for your business per se, but they might be more aggressive about term length or availability for an earlier stage business. And then you have specialized alternative lenders. We can definitely be more consultative and plug into specific areas of your working capital gap, but it's unlikely that we'll be able to address the entirety of your working capital gap. And we would advise you to work with, work alongside other financing providers that can address that you can patch together to address your whole working capital gap. The last point on this I mentioned is if you choose a lender with domain and logistics, domain experience in logistics, and that's not just working capital. I mean, there's plenty of banks that have logistics-focused trade finance or lending arms. You will be able to get availability on your in-transit inventory, which typically, traditional lender or non-bank lender might not provide. So you want to think about identifying the type of facility you like, preparing the optimal lender presentation package that you can send to a group of lenders to get a variety of offers. Pick the one that's best for your business. Pick the partner that you like the most for your business. You want clean financial statements, bank reports, loan agreements. All the standard package that you can just send to a variety of providers. And you also want to share your sales projections and the work that you've done on your inventory planning with these partners. The lenders are going to want to understand your inventory aging, how you project inventory and what they're lending into, and your skill at sort of managing that part of your business. So the last piece here is how do you grow and improve? And really, this is, I call this, the iterative nature of lending, but it applies to your supply chain as well, which is every year you have an opportunity to go back and have a conversation with your partner and say, how do we structure this best for next year? And as a business owner or a finance executive or a supply chain executive, how do I use my increased scale and buying power to my advantage? And as you prove that value and consistency as a business partner to your suppliers, your logistics partners, and your finance providers, you will continue to drive better terms with all of them, lower rates, longer terms, and this is for suppliers and for financing providers and for freight providers. And you sort of will start to create a virtuous cycle of improving your supply chain each year that I think we love to see when we partner with businesses. So that is it for me. I will hand it back over to Ted, who's going to wrap it up and give us a bunch of tools that we can use to focus on how to pull all this together, optimizing your inventory and cash cycle.
Thank you, Justin. And before we dive into these tools we can use, a couple questions that we've been getting through the audience that have been rolling in. So one, Justin, you mentioned that you can attack the working capital problem through tooling and process. And you mentioned a couple good tools that you could use. Can you share a little bit more on either various technology solutions that you've seen companies use or recommendations that you might have for particular areas where people can get better, such as the AR, AP process, so on and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, we've had a lot of conversations with Talia and TradeShift to learn more about their solutions because I think it's an area that a lot of our clients sort of struggle with, which is how do I manage payments to all of my suppliers overseas? My bank takes a couple of days to process these payments. I can't tell if the supplier got it unless they see the money in their bank account. It's things like that where these, AP automation companies or even Bill.com is starting to do a bit more work on allowing international payments in the platform. We've spoken with a bunch of payments companies such as Veeam and Airwallex and Tempest, who sort of will provide international payment solutions. So I would say there's I would look first to some of those supplier management and AP automation tools. Start with something that's probably more of a platform than a point solution, especially if this is your first time implementing something like this. The other question is, what sort of ERP system are you using? If you're still on QuickBooks, then you should probably evolve up to the next level of ERP system before you start to think about, more specialized finance function software. Because the larger ERP solutions will have some of these capabilities as well. So hopefully that's specific enough, Ted.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, and for the broader audience, let's do a quick recap of some of the tools that you can use, and let's close out giving some advice on how you can take next steps forward. So to summarize some of the recommendations that we have made over the course of the last hour, I think one of the primary recommendations is that you need to be modeling out your cash cycle. So Justin showed a good graphic that showed a 120-day working capital cycle. And I think it's incumbent upon every business owner or operations professional to have a view on this. No matter what, when you go out and look for either a lending partner or someone else, they're going to want to see this data. So it's necessary to actually secure financing. It's also crucial for you to understand where you are today so that you can start to pull days out of your cycle, whether that's renegotiating payment terms, improving your technology or process. Something to pull those days out is going to limit the actual magnitude of your working capital challenge. And once you've modeled that cycle, it's going to allow you to forecast your working capital needs. And that really serves as the base layer for you to go through and then contact financing partners. I think Justin gave some good practical advice on how you can prepare for that. He sees lots of sort of memos come through, and he's evaluated a lot of them over time. And so he sees what's successful, and usually individuals who have a good grasp on their order to cash cycle are more successful in reaching out to financing partners. And I think it was good advice to consider a variety of partners who may be better fits for your business. And then Andre and Jeet talked a lot about creating a supply and demand model. I know that was one of the hot topics where people are looking for a lot of assistance. I think they gave some good advice on how to get started. What I would tell you, though, is if you're looking at this and you're saying, I really still don't know where to go, take action. Reach out to our friends at OnTap. This is exactly what they specialize in. They have models that have been built already and are proven to help small businesses grow and thrive with that model. And then one that's really near and dear to my heart is make sure that you're storing and analyzing historical data. And this is somewhere where Flexport can help a lot. I mean, we have created the platform for global trade, and so all of our customers have a rich set of data that they can look back to use to make more accurate supply and demand models. So this involves your transit times. You can look back at supplier performance to see how often cargo ready dates are moved out. You can look at landed cost per SKU data, and you can, most importantly, create set reports that are going to run that you can feed into your recurring supply and demand planning cycle. So, we've talked about that a lot as a discipline, and Flexport is a platform that's going to help you in that discipline. So as we're wrapping up, let's answer a few questions. I know we're at the top of the hour, but we're happy to go a little bit beyond if you want to stick with us. So one of the questions that I thought was really essential here was how companies can get good data to use, especially for demand forecasts, and what to do when the projections from sales and marketing and other groups are very far off. So Andre, I'm sure that you've encountered this situation where the sales and marketing team think that one thing is going to happen and maybe some other functions believe differently. How do you adjudicate in that situation? What's the process of trying to get down to a firm forecast when you might have different points of view in the room?
Okay, great question, Ted. Thank you. So, forecasting is particularly tough if you have a new product and you don't have any history on that product. Once you've been through a full year, you can see the seasonality. You get to learn how the product is going to perform, and it gets easier. But what do you do at the beginning if you don't have any idea? What we recommend is to look for similar products at similar price points, something that's analogous that you can use as a rough benchmark. Think about your industry, think about adjacent industries, talk to your investors, find something that's analogous and use that as a starting point. Another thing that you can do is should do is begin to test, marketing and sales programs. If you're doing keyword buys, how does that affect your demand? These are things that can be tested on a small scale, and then you can apply it. You can make inferences and apply it on a grander picture. So try to get some data, some benchmarking to get your forecasts started. And then after that, if you still have disagreements, the key is, I think, something that Jeet said earlier, which is decide for your business whether you prefer to be under or over. Assume you'll be wrong, and which direction do you want to be wrong in? If you're very tight on cash, you may decide that you'll allow the product to sell out, and you're going to be okay with that.
Fantastic advice. And I think, G, you've had a lot of experience creating these types of models from your time at Apple and in other places. And I remember back to a presentation that you gave once that I found very insightful on some of the different factors, including sort of seasonality, different campaigns that are running. So what are some of the things that a small company could look at that for a fact influence demand for most businesses?
So looking at your company run rate is a super helpful starting point. Like, what is the current trajectory of the business? Looking at how you're investing in sales and marketing, and how coming up with estimates for how that's going to support certain growth of your current run rate. Looking at seasonality, so depending on the type of product. So Andre mentioned this as a consideration. If you're very heavy into the holiday season, or it's like a gift item, you may want to factor that into the timing of when you're going to see a spike in demand. And lastly, you may also want to consider the general state of the economy, right? So are people buying more? Like, how are they buying stuff? Especially now, if people are staying home more, people are shopping online more than they were shopping in stores. So that's, I would say, the next level of nuance of not just how much to plan for, but where you think people are going to go to get your product.
Thank you, G. Always a complex set of variables that go into forecasting. As Andre said, all forecasts are wrong, and the goal is to start minimizing the delta between our forecast and the actuals, which is a muscle that has to be exercised. And that actually brings us to the end of this webinar. So thank you all so much for attending. Hopefully you feel more confident in addressing inventory planning and your cash cycle. As always, your friends at Flexport and OnTap are here to help you. You can navigate to the bottom left of your screen, and that's a way to reach out to OnTap. There's also a one-pager for Flexport Capital. And you're welcome to reach out to us directly over LinkedIn or other mediums. And we will do our absolute best to help you grow your business into a thriving enterprise, which is what all of us want for you. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure being your host today, and hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.